discuss them in this forum. Each research integrity seminar, which is conducted once a month, we have a speaker for each session and a respondent. A speaker presents a topic, followed by a discussion session, a rather informal session. So to kick off today's speaker and our seminar today, I would like to give a very warm welcome to Rita Faria, who is with us here, I guess from Portugal.
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you so much for being here with us. So Rita is an assistant professor of criminology at the School of Criminology, the Faculty of Law at the University of Porto. She's also the director of Interdisciplinary Research Center on Crime, Justice and Security. And she will be sharing with us some insights on the relationship between research misconduct in the field of her. After we have the pleasure of having Marietta, who will kick off the discussion section with, then it's open to the floor. So feel free to mute yourself and start with the discussion. So I'll first hand it over to Rita.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you especially to Marietta, who is the responsible for you having to put up with me for a few minutes. It's great to see you all. And thank you for having me. So I'll be quick. This is a quite informal session, but I have to confess that I prepared a rather, I don't know, a session about the research that I've been conducting in the last few years about research misconduct. So I'm going to just show you very briefly some of the things that I've been looking at in research misconduct. And obviously I will be arguing that social sciences are needed when discussing and studying research misconduct, particularly criminology, as you've already guessed. So without further ado, I'm just going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you. Feel free to interrupt me if you want to, but I'm going to share the presentation, and thank you once again for having me here and taking some time off your lunch hour to listen to me talk about research misconduct. So just a very brief overview of what criminology is. I think that the most important thing to retain from here is that it is an empirical science, and it usually looks at a very wide set of behaviors that go from understanding the offender's motivations and causes, understanding or analyzing crime trends, but also looking at victims and harms that are generated from crime, but also very particularly looking at what we call social control. So that means the ways that society reacts to crime, be it by its formal mechanisms like the police, the courts, prisons, but also by informal mechanisms like peers, neighborhoods, schools, etc. I just wanted also to point out that even we usually tend to think about criminology as looking at crime and the criminal, not only criminology does more than that. It usually looks at all that is around offending, rule breaking, and those may be criminal rules, but they can also be social rules, social norms, or other forms of norms that may be considered interesting and pertinent to study. Okay, so it is not only crime that we look at, we also look at what we call as deviance or breaches to social norms. So obviously the question is research misconduct a topic for criminology? Well, when I first started studying research misconduct around 2009, 2010, because I've been studying since my master's thesis, my fellow criminologists considered it to be a very exotic topic for criminology. And my own experience showed me that there was not that much opening to this topic in criminology. But I also remember that when I attended in 2015 the 4th World Conference on Research Integrity, that research, I think I was the only criminologist there, and most researchers were debating some aspects that were very traditional for criminologists to discuss, and that criminology has been dealing with since the 19th century. For instance, does sanction work? Should we punish people who misbehave? Should we stigmatize them, or should we try to reintegrate them into, for instance, universities and research? So I remember feeling that although this topic is not a traditional topic in criminology, or it was not at the time, most debates that I was looking at and dealing with were debates that were very familiar to criminology. Why do people do it? Why don't they obey the rules? Are the rules effective or not? Don't offenders fear punishment? Who detects these behaviors? So a lot of questions were very, very familiar to me, although the topic in itself was not traditionally a criminological topic. So I persevered and I didn't mind that my topic was considered to be exotic. That was also a challenge, but a good one. And I think I tried to do the most out of it. And so I did my master's, but also more importantly, my PhD on the topic. And I took an approach, which I think from criminology is relevant, which is to consider research misconduct as a form of white-collar crime or white-collar deviance. This is very simply put, so misbehavior or rule-breaking behavior or harmful acts that are committed by people in the course of their legitimate occupation, as it happens as with research misconduct committed by researchers, as simple as that. So we're not talking about the gangster, we're not talking about the drug addict in an alley, we're not talking about robbers, we're talking about people who use their professions to commit misbehaviors. And so white-collar crime is a category that can be applied to corruption, to, I don't know, fraud, professional fraud, financial fraud, etc. But from my perspective, could also be used as a lens to analyze research misconduct. Obviously, that in criminology, we know for almost a century that these kinds of deviance and crimes bring special challenges to criminologists. They're not as easy to research as regular conventional crimes, as we call it, because they don't usually happen on the streets. There's no victim that can complain, a direct victim that can complain and go to the police and tell people, well, I've been robbed. In the case of research misconduct, usually there's only plagiarism where there is a direct victim. Otherwise, the cases where there are direct victims are very, very rare. It's very hard to uncover, and the most difficult thing, I think, of all, is that it gets hidden. White-collar crime in general, but research misconduct as well. It's hidden by the organizational and institutional processes and structures. Research misconduct, as any other type of white-collar crime, happens inside regular normative institutions that are relevant and important for societies, such as universities or research institutes. So I did my PhD research. I know that some information is now outdated, but still I'm going to present you some of the most relevant results that I think I got from that time. For instance, I interviewed scholars all over Europe and asked them what did they know, or if they have ever known about a series of behaviors. So I didn't ask them if they had committed these behaviors. That would probably lead to very few responses because of one thing called social desirability. People don't like to speak, especially adults who consider themselves normative people, don't usually like to speak about their deviant behaviors. So I asked them if they had known about situations, a series of situations. And what was interesting to see from the interviews is that most researchers were very aware of a series of different practices that we that are most interested in research misconduct already acknowledge, but that eventually most people are not completely or fully aware. So we had the more traditional authorship practices or misbehaviors around authorship practices that include traditional plagiarism. But for instance, people were also very aware of cases of questionable practices such as self-plagiarism and plagiarism of ideas or concepts. My interviewees were also concerned about guest authorship and ghost authorship, and they knew about situations and gave examples of such. They were also concerned, and they told me about experiences or cases they had heard about the traditional FF in the FFP triad, right? The traditional cooking or falsification of data, as well as the more subtle data trimming. But they were also, for instance, concerned about biased interpretations of data, how the interpretation that you do don't match the data because of a series of causes. They were also concerned, and they knew about cases of bias in peer assessment, both at job appointments, so when someone is applying for a job in academia, and power plays and other factors other than pure scientific merit came into play, but also they were aware of bias in peer assessment during the publication process, so bias in peer review, but also for publication, but also for grant awarding and funding processes. They also told me about how problematic relations with external actors could be. And they mentioned situations that could be considered traditional, so to say, cases of conflict of interest, which I call ambivalence, where someone has two hats and we don't really know if that person is wearing a hat of the researcher or of someone with personal economic interests in a research or a specific outcome. And they also mentioned other cases, for instance, of interference in the research process from commissioners and funders of research, which I think is quite serious situation. In a nutshell, what I concluded is that in the current research system, at least in Europe, what was happening is that funding and recognition as goals, so the goals of being funded and getting recognized, became more important both for academics, for individuals, and for the organizations, so for research institutions, for universities. These goals were more important than the basic goal of conducting sound, ethical, and integral research. And this happened by a series of mechanisms that were put into place. Pressure, which is something that most of us is quite unfortunately used to, but also a series of other mechanisms that could be pushing researchers towards committing research misconduct, such as ineffective social control of research misconduct. And there were a lot of cases of people telling me that all situations were silenced. They were mentioned only in the corridors. There were no formal consequences when people misbehaved. So this ineffective social control of research misconduct led people to think that, well, no serious harm will be generated from questionable practices or pure fraud. The other thing was that most researchers considered that there was no real alternative to caving in, so to say, to the pressure to publish. There was no real alternative to in securing a job if you would not put your outputs above the need for creating outputs, above the need to be rigorous and ethical and integral. So most people considered that there was no really, to be honest, reward in being integral and ethical. And this added to the scarce resources. So people had to fight over scarce resources, like scarce job opportunities, lack of funding, scarce tools and material resources to conduct research. So with all these mechanisms in action, obviously not everybody commits research misconduct. And so there were a series of individual adaptations or reactions to this wide system of meanings and actions and structures. Some people just accepted the rules of the game and were aware that at some point or another, they could be feeling the pressure to commit some kind of questionable research practice, self-plagiarism, or for instance, trimming data a bit. But all the people, other academics, other researchers felt that or mentioned other ways of reacting to this system, to this mechanisms, structural mechanisms, such as resisting. And they usually were quite aware that if they were to resist the rules of the game, they would be losing a lot of opportunities and of funding. Trying to fit in, so was a third reaction. So people would try to know the rules of the game and navigate around the rules of the game without trying to be aware of eventual misbehavior that they or others could commit, but still trying to be aware of how to navigate the existing setting of research in Europe. And then there were a last resort, which was giving up, and we can see a lot of that. I think there's even a Twitter hashtag which is leaving academia, and if you follow that, you can see a lot of narratives, quite desperate narratives of how academia let people down, and they were moving on to other job opportunities. In sum, it means that there were, well, at least at the time of my research, there was a convergence between funding and recognition goals that people, academics, felt, but that they were somehow imposed, transmitted in organizational structures such as universities or research institutes. And in the end, this meant that benefits obtained from research misconduct could be exceeding the associated risks of being detected and sanctioned by committing such behaviors. And in the end, goals about being rigor and ethical and integral when conducting research were being put aside or undervalued in favor of those very, very important and relevant goals of getting funding and being recognized. Both, again, by individuals, but goals which were also very important for organizations, for universities. Let me just put this on. By analyzing the documents that at the time were supposed to set out the guidelines to regulate and prevent research misconduct, I looked at a series of documents issued by a number of international or supranational organizations. And with what I discovered is that while the traditional FFP was usually was often mentioned in these documents, other forms of questionable research misconduct were usually lacking from them. And so these general guidelines of what to do, what is research misconduct, what to do in situations of research misconduct and how to prevent, they didn't really were too concerned about what we now call questionable research practices. So most of the documents that I analyzed and that again had the purpose to regulate science and prevent and provide some guidelines on how to deal with research misconduct, they didn't really have, and that was very surprising to me, they were not backed up, most of the times they were not backed up by data or explanations on research misconduct. So these were policy documents with a very fragile evidence based, which for me was very, very troubling, to be honest. Overall, these documents were incoherent and did not agree on what research misconduct is or should be or how it should be conceptualized. And they didn't offer clear and uniform solutions for the reaction systems or the social control systems that they intended to apply, or that they proposed for states and universities to have. Usually these were documents which were mostly concerned about how were citizens and policymakers to trust science when research misconduct happens. And they were very concerned on how to create and maintain this international scientific market where researchers, research outputs, papers, funding crosses all of this, crosses borders. And so this new globalization, not new, but well, this trend in globalization and the internationalization of science was bringing new issues about how to trust science, how to trust scientists about their integrity and about the seriousness of their science and scientific endeavors. They also proposed very different systems for science to be regulated. Some documents in some instances were were asking for a more muscled, stronger self-regulation system. And others were already trying to suggest that science should be regulated from the outside by third-party institutions. So there was no real consensus on how to deal with research misconduct. Oh, sorry.
Rita, if you will be rounding up, that will give us sufficient time for the questions.
Thanks. Yes. So just more recently, just to let you know, I conducted an evaluation research on a PhD program for preventing research misconduct. This resulted in a series of mixed methods, research with mixed methods. And this was interesting to see, in very briefly, if this training that intended to prevent research misconduct was fulfilling its aims. And for instance, with this array of methods, I managed to conclude that the program was being well implemented, considering its goals, considering the trainers, and considering what kind of messages it wanted to convey. But for instance, it showed quite clearly that most participants attended this training in order to get another reward, which is in this case credits for their courses, but that somehow they were already sensible, aware of the importance of research misconduct and research integrity, before attending the course. So it was a case eventually of preaching to those who were already converted. Nonetheless, we could describe that even if these people, the trainees, were already quite interested in research in research integrity and preventing research misconduct, they had, and this is interesting to assess, I think, they had somehow felt or experienced previous forms of research misconduct themselves, eventually more as victims, so being exploited, being denied the paper, being denied authorship in some cases. So participants had already been subjected to some form of ethical or integrity dilemma that made them more aware and eventually choose this particular course on preventing research misconduct. Nonetheless, after the training, we could see, even if it was a small sample, that the students improved their knowledge, for instance, about questionable research practices. They felt more confident and they were more knowledgeable about research integrity and how to prevent research misconduct, particularly knowing where to go to or who to go to in case of doubt, in case they had any questions, and they felt more confident and less prone, so to say, to be pushed around by other people regarding the solution of integrity dilemmas. So in sum, even if it was a very small example of an assessment, usually the training had some positive impact on on the participants. And I think this is something that should be done more often, even if there are some evaluations, some assessments have been made, namely by Kalikman. But even so, I think it was a really interesting experience to conduct. And that obviously led to some suggestions to improving the course. So finishing, last slide. These are some of the very broad questions that a criminologist could have when studying research misconduct and ways to prevent it. So either both looking at the individual and the organizations where it occurs, why it occurs, what does it mean, what kinds of rewards are embedded in this, in breaking the rules, etc. What are the opportunities that present themselves to researchers to break the rules? But also, and as important as this, from my perspective, how do we assess, how can we make sure that the rules are being enforced? First, that they exist, then that they are being enforced, then that research misconduct is being detected and eventually leading to some kind of sanction. And if this sanction is appropriate to create deterrence, and eventually what kind of prevention actions are taking place. So thank you so much. And I'm so ready for your questions. So feel free, and for your discussion, Marietta, so feel free.